Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here at my wormery and I've got a European nightcrawler bin down there on the bottom left that I'd like to feed today. It's a fairly new bin, 27 days of age at this point, and 10 days since it was last fed. But I figured another thing that we could combine with the feeding of that system was the release of the European nightcrawlers from my most recent time-lapse container, which you see right here. And I actually produced 2 time-lapse videos using this setup over here. And it's been 165 days since the worms were originally introduced into this container, and I think the time has come to release them, cut them loose, and I'm sure they'll be happy to be able to roam around in somewhat larger, uncramped conditions, because, you know, this container really is not very large at all. The main focus of the last time-lapse that I shot in this container was mites, so I know that there's also a bunch of mites that occupy this container, but I believe that they occupy the top layer of this material. So before taking the bottom portion of this where the worms all reside, I believe I'm going to scoop out all this material from the top and take that stuff outside, since I believe it is riddled with mites. And then what we'll do is we'll release the remainder of the material into my European nightcrawler bin. So that's the game plan. I'm going to get a glove on and we'll get right to work. Before heading upstairs to go grab the food that we're going to feed the other bin over there with, I figured I would also take the time really quickly to scoop out that banana that you saw resting on the top of this material, as well as excavating some of the material that was right beneath the banana, because mixed in with that stuff was also a couple cantaloupe rinds. I assume that between the banana and the cantaloupe rinds, as well as all the surrounding material, I've probably managed to scoop out most, if not all, of the mites, or at least I'm hoping that's the case. So while I'm upstairs dumping that and fetching food to feed the bin with, I think I'm going to maybe set the time-lapse up like we do sometimes. And it's usually the time-lapse that I use to try to determine if I've got mites. Because with the time-lapse running, I can, you know, observe slow-moving creatures within the bin, and those would be the mites. So my idea here was to set the camera up while I'm upstairs, give it a few minutes just to shoot the space here within this container to see what kind of movement we're able to observe. And hopefully by doing so, we'll be able to spot whether or not there's still mites in this container. So I'm going to switch over to time-lapse, and then we'll be able to see what's going on in here. You know, if there's a few mites, I'm not worried about it. I think what I'm doing in my regular bin, where all this stuff is going to be released into with a lot of bedding, reduced moisture, even if there's mites in here and we release them into that container over there, I think, you know, their numbers are going to gradually diminish. So I'm guessing that a lot of these little tiny white specks we're observing are probably mites. But we'll know for sure once we get to play back some of that time-lapse footage. So while I head upstairs to take care of a couple things, let's go ahead and shoot some time-lapse. Well, if the camera was reading correctly, that should account for about 20 or so seconds of time-lapse footage, and it'll be curious to see what's creeping and crawling down there. But even if there are some mites in here, I don't think it's the end of the world. I think that I've come up with a pretty decent strategy at this point for you know, trying to reduce the numbers of mites in my active worm bins, so I'm not worried too much about it. We'll go ahead and we'll dump the contents of that container into this bin, but I think first we'll go ahead and we'll check out the contents of this, see how things are looking, apply the food and get that buried down below the surface and covered up to some point, and then on top I think we'll go ahead and we'll release the worms out of the time-lapse container. So let's open things up, see how things are progressing, get some food in here, and set the stage for a little bit of a worm release from our time-lapse container. And I don't know, I had thought about maybe just getting rid of some of that compost that's in that time-lapse container, because it does seem extremely heavily worked by the worms. But I think I'm just going to release it all into here, worms and all, because maybe it's not as bad as I thought. It just seemed like it's very, you know, very, maybe overworked sort of compost. So now, I guess my one concern in this bin from the last time I was in here was the addition of a lot of dry materials, like all these dry leaves on the top and stuff, and only the addition of some not frozen foods. Last time I fed, usually I feed frozen foods, but the last time I fed foods that were not frozen. It made me think that maybe there would not be such a huge amount of moisture released by those foods that were added last time. Because I know that when I add something that's been frozen, as it thaws, it's releasing a good amount of moisture into my worm bin. But, you know, by placing foods in here that I knew had not been frozen, I wondered how much moisture that stuff would emit. I mean, I know it's got a certain moisture content, and I know it'll all eventually be released from the foods into the material in the bin. But I always got this sense that by freezing the foods, that release of the moisture from the foods that they're being fed is just a lot more rapid. But I don't think that there's really a whole lot to worry about. I guess the other reason I was concerned about moisture in this system is that I've abandoned the coverings of plastic, and as you saw, I was covered with cardboard and newspaper only. So that would allow for a little bit more airflow, a little bit more evaporation of moisture. But it seems like the bin is holding its moisture quite nicely. The material all feels nice and damp. And I'm starting to run into some of the leftovers from last time. These look like they're just bits and pieces of cabbage. This piece hardly looks like it was even broken down at all. So maybe by not freezing these pieces down, maybe I've, you know, somewhat delayed their breakdown process. Here too, this thing actually looks like it's trying to grow roots rather than get broken down and eaten by the worms. So, yeah, you know, this is all obviously stuff the worms will eventually be able to feed on. Maybe by not having frozen it ahead of time, it's just hampering its ability to get broken down and get taken advantage of by the worms as food. So it'll obviously go right back in as food for the worms, and over time it will break down, but it does seem like over these past 10 days not a lot of deterioration of the material has occurred. It's still pretty fresh. So the worms have probably had to make do with whatever was in here from previous feedings. And like I said, that stuff will all become available to the worms as it starts to decompose. So I'm kind of glad that we're in here to give this system a little bit more food, some stuff that's been frozen, some stuff that's gonna definitely release a lot of moisture as it thaws out. And since it's been frozen, I believe that that also kind of jump starts the decomposition process so that the worms can hopefully get on that food right away, and then maybe get their attention back to this stuff at a later time once it starts to break down a little bit more. So we'll just make some room here so we could plop in today's feeding. I was just curious to see how this old food was doing, so I was kind of picking through and excavating it all to check it all out, but I don't think we're going to see anything much different if we locate any more pieces in here. They're going to be kind of in that same sort of early stage of decomposition, but still not quite at that point where it's going to be of much use to the worms yet, I believe. So it's a good thing that we're in here applying some more food. So last time we were in here, we used these old pieces of newspaper right here. Pieces of newspaper that had been covering up the top surface of the bin. And we had laid them in under the food as sort of a foundation to place the feeding into, or on top of. And a lot of times the feedings that I apply, as they're thawing and as they're releasing moisture and decomposing, they release a lot of moisture down onto the paper that I place right beneath the feedings. But in this case, I think that this cabbage, these cabbage leaves, these potato peels, all these items that were placed in here as the last feeding, I don't think that they emitted a great deal of moisture. So these chunks of paper that had been placed under the food last time are still pretty much intact. So we're just going to recycle them and place them back in under the food that we're adding today. And I believe that the food that we're adding today is going to drop a bunch of moisture, a bunch of juices down onto this paper, making this paper really yummy for the worms. So here's the food stash that I bought down here for them, and it's quite a bit. Maybe I went a little bit overboard. It's a whole bunch of really tiny fragments of all kinds of stuff. I reached down deep into the freezer bag to pull out all kinds of little bits and pieces of stuff. And here obviously we've got some coffee, and I've even got some soiled paper towels that we can even use as additional bedding down beneath the food. So as I've been doing lately, I've been really generous with the bedding lately. So we're gonna kind of follow suit with that new way of thinking and make sure we're nice and generous with the application of bedding. And this coffee filter here, once we add the coffee in too, that's also going to serve as a nice boost to the bedding, because the coffee filter is just paper and it's yet more bedding for the bin. So you can see this is a pretty nice arrangement of different stuff. Here's a banana peel. These are some stems of mushrooms. This is mango peels, asparagus, the peelings of cucumber, as well as I saw the butt end of a cucumber somewhere. It was pretty big. Where did it go? It's right here. Right? All stuff that's got nice moisture content. As it starts to thaw, it's all going to emit moisture. This is probably just a variety of stuff sort of frozen together. Yeah, that's what it is. You can even see some condensed ice, some, you know, freezing, some moisture, just direct moisture, frozen right onto the food items. So we'll just combine the feeding from 10 days ago with the feeding from today. And once you put it all together, you can see that it's quite a generous amount of food. So it'll hopefully last quite a bit of I don't know, what was it, 10 days since we last fed. And I got a feeling we could probably, you know, come back in here 10 days from now and still probably see some leftovers. And the leftovers we see will most likely still be this cabbage here, because who knows how long that'll take to break down. I bet you all the other stuff is probably going to become really popular, stuff that the worms are going to jump right on and break down pretty quickly. So yeah, let's see. You know what? Let's grab some grit. The grit that I use is this pulverized eggshell. And since this is still a fairly new bin, I try to be pretty generous with the grit in my newer bins, so that they've got plenty of stuff to break down all of their food and bedding with. So that's a nice application of grit right there. Let's not forget the last little food portion here, which is the coffee. A whole bunch of nice bite-sized food for them to enjoy. And here again, more bedding, more carbon-based bedding materials, paper, to add to the bin. So with these being nightcrawlers, and the nightcrawlers definitely are a type of worm that likes to eat a lot of carbon-based type foods, so they chew through their bedding just as readily as they chew through their fresh kitchen scraps and food items that they're given. So they'll probably appreciate all that stuff in there as a nice feeding, not only the food, but all the paper items that were added, all that paper towel, all that coffee filter, all that good stuff. And we'll just start covering up here. And there's all kinds of stuff to use to cover up here. Here's a mango seed with only one worm on it. Usually these things are really popular, and sometimes they're not. I don't know why. So I'm just going to put a nice crack in it, so this way the worms can actually access the inside of it. Because the seed part of it, the inside of it, is what I believe that they really like. Maybe they're just not on it because they're just frustrated with the inability to access the inside of it. I don't know. Alright, so before we cover up here, we've got one more matter at hand, and that's the release of the material and the worms in my time-lapse container. So I'm going to pause the camera and bring that thing over here and we'll dump it in. Alright, so I was able to jiggle this plastic container off of its backing board. And I guess the nice thing is that I also had this piece of cellophane sort of protecting the backing board from all the moisture that would be within the bin. So it enabled me to kind of pull it all off in such a way that the whole thing was nice and neatly contained, so I didn't make a big mess, stuff flying all over the place. So I'll just remove the cellophane. And then what we're going to be left with here is a nice package of finished worm compost, Vermicompost. It's got a good number of worms in it. It's got a good number of pot worms in it too. If you watch the time-lapse video, I could leave a link to it up in the corner of the screen for you to watch. The time-lapse video, the more recent time-lapse video, certainly shows a good amount of pot worms occupying this space, possibly a great number more pot worms in here than European nightcrawlers. So let me see how I can hopefully release this material out of here gracefully. I was kind of hoping it would almost all slide out in one felt swoop. I'm almost wondering if I need a little bit of a tool or something to scoop with. Luckily I have a stick here that we could use to try to dislodge this material, because this stuff has really worked, you know. Every time I would watch the time-lapse footage, I would look at this material and it would look to me like it was just so heavily worked already. And you can see worms squirming around through the material. They look quite content to just keep moving through the stuff. And it didn't seem like they were having trouble moving through it either. So even though it looked like the material was extremely worked, it didn't seem like it was causing a problem for the worms. And now that I actually look at it, I could see good amounts of fibrous stuff in here. I did use COCO in the setup of this bin and during numerous additions of bedding materials. The other thing I see here is cocoons. I could see a couple cocoons right there. I could see one right there. Saw a couple over here as well, one right there. So even though it's a tiny little container, and a lot of times you'll hear, well, there's a couple more cocoons right there. A lot of times you'll hear about how worms will usually try to regulate their population based on the amount of space that they can sense that they're occupying. It doesn't seem like these worms felt like they were too crowded into this space, because otherwise you wouldn't really see any cocoons, right? So sometimes I wonder about those sorts of bits and pieces of information that you gather about worm composting, whether they're true or not, or what's the real story when it comes to that sort of information. So there's not a whole lot left in here. I just want to make sure we get all the worms. I'm not so worried about the compost itself. I just don't want to leave any worms behind. But I think we've pretty much got them all. I'm being a little bit rough here. Hopefully I'm not injuring any worms in the process. Just that the stuff is caked on here quite hard. Yeah, I think we've got it all. And there's still a little bit of material stuck to the container, but as far as I could tell, we've got all the worms out. So that's cool. Just make sure. Yeah, we're good. So it's not very easy to see how many worms we've got in here, but there's a few. There's quite a number. I'm just going to spread the material out here a little bit, get a better sense of what we're dealing with. And I was worried, I wasn't sure if these worms were able to take advantage of that banana that was sitting on the top of the surface, if that was really food that they were able to dig into, whether there was enough bedding. I mean, you saw that there was some leaves scattered across the top as well, stuff that I pulled out and took outside with the banana and with what I thought to be the mites. But I'm still getting this sense from looking at all this little tiny white specks in this that I'm probably bringing a whole bunch of mites over into this container by doing this. But hopefully I'm going to be able to control the mite numbers in this system by being really generous with bedding and keeping the bin a little bit drier by not covering up with plastic. So even if I'm bringing mites over, I'm not too concerned about it. But you know, I am curious, so I might shoot a little bit more time-lapse. I just don't want to miss these as opportunities to get a better sense of what I'm really dealing with here. So I'm going to switch over to time-lapse just to see, you know, how much movement there is out here. And then I'll get a better sense of exactly, you know, how many mites did I just transplant into this worm bin here. Hopefully not too many, but let's take a look. All right, well, that should give us about another 15 or 20 seconds worth of time-lapse footage to examine, to see what we see. And I guess the one nice thing about just sitting here waiting for the time-lapse to play out was that I had a chance to just stare down into the bin and look at the material, and I could see, you know, cocoon, cocoon, cocoon. Just, you know, there's cocoons scattered all over the place in this material. So besides reintroducing the worms that had been placed into this time-lapse container to perform for us in the time-lapse videos, we've also not just reintroduced the worms back into here, but we've also brought along their cocoons, which are going to even increase the numbers in this bin even more. And if I'm not mistaken, this is the bin that I believe to have the fewest number of worms in it. Something in the neighborhood of maybe 750, I believe, is the estimate that I have for the number of worms in this bin. But I'm going to update it now. Since we've reintroduced a bunch of worms, and we could see that we've also bought a bunch of cocoons along for the ride as well. Not knowing for sure how many it is, I'm just going to put an estimate down as another 250 worms being put back into this bin, bringing me up to a nice round number of 1,000 worms in this bin, which is a pretty good sized population at this point, but it still might be the lowest population in my wormery. Although maybe I've got one other system that I have that has an estimated 1,000 European nightcrawlers in it. I can't recall. So like I usually like to do, rather than placing my top covering sheets of paper, cardboard right onto the castings type materials, I usually like to lay down a little sort of natural material coating for the bin. And it's a nice little added bedding boost once again. And that's kind of been the theme here in my wormery lately, is more bedding, more bedding. And even though this stuff is also going in dry, I'm not too worried, because it does seem like we added a lot of frozen foods that are going to emit moisture, releasing their moisture into this bin as they thaw and as they break down. Yeah, as well as a bunch of fairly damp castings out of the time-lapse container too. So I think that all this material in here is going to get nice and hydrated over time. And who knows, it'll probably be another maybe 10 days, or probably could be longer, just based on the amount of food that we put in here before the next time we check in on this container. Because I think it's in good shape at this point to, you know, to press on for another week and a half, maybe even 2 weeks before we have to check in on it again. So that's it for today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.